He carried freedom in his hands, medals, stripes, folded flags, yet never dared to set himself free. In a quiet town tucked into the valleys of Colorado, Walter Dempsey lived alone in a cabin that hadn't changed in years. To his neighbors, he was a man of discipline, a decorated veteran, a father who raised his son the right way. They didn't know the part of him that had stayed behind on foreign soil, buried beneath sand, silence, and a name no one was allowed to speak out loud. Walter came back from the war, but the man he was never really did. Each morning started the same. He'd wake before dawn, brew a pot of bitter black coffee, step outside with a cigarette he never lit, and watch the pine trees hold their breath in the cold air. The house still held traces of a family that had once lived there. A wedding photo now kept face down in a drawer, a handmade card from Father's Day with childish handwriting, a broken frame near the fireplace that no one bothered to fix. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, the sound of a door that never truly closed. Walter was known for being private, but not unfriendly. When Evan, his only son, came over on weekends, he'd put on the act stoic, fair, never cruel. He asked about school, offered him tools, taught him how to fix what was broken. They never spoke of feelings, never about the divorce, and certainly never about why Walter had been different ever since his return from Iraq. In that household, healing came in the form of shared silence. Words were sharp objects, best left untouched. There was a room Evan wasn't allowed to enter, the storage shed behind the house, where Walter kept all the remnants of a man he no longer let himself be. His military gear was stored there. His journals, letters, medals, things even Evan's mother hadn't been allowed to touch. It had always been off limits, no explanation, just like everything else. But there was one thing no one could stop: the way the world outside that house kept changing. In Evan's school, the rainbow flags no longer came with fear. The word gay didn't feel like a threat. His friends had parents who were out and proud. Some had 2 moms, one had 2 dads. Evan never brought it up with his father, but somewhere deep down, he always knew Walter was hiding something. It wasn't shame, it was ache, a kind of ache that made a man flinch when others laughed too loud. That made him look away when love showed itself too honestly. And then came the school's annual Pride Week. Evan volunteered to help with the student theater performance. They needed costumes specifically, military uniforms for a short play about identity, service, and sacrifice. Evan thought of one thing: the shed. He waited until Sunday afternoon when Walter had left to run errands in town. The key wasn't hard to find, tucked behind the propane tank, exactly where it had been since he was 10. He walked into the shed slowly, like entering a tomb. Dust hung in the air like unspoken truths. The air was thick with memories that didn't belong to him. Then he saw it: a box, labeled in faded marker. Kuwait, personal. Inside was the uniform, clean, pressed, folded with care. On top of it, a letter sealed in a plastic bag, yellowed with time but unbroken. The name signed at the bottom was Markus. Evan didn't know who that was, but he knew what it meant. The play would go on, and so would the truth. Subscribe to Heart Stories for more powerful stories of silence, courage, and the love that refuses to stay buried. The letter was written in neat, compact cursive words pressed tightly together, as if afraid of being overheard even on paper. Evan sat cross-legged in the shed, the envelope resting on his knees, afraid to open something that clearly wasn't meant for him. But the weight of it, the care in its preservation, told him this wasn't a letter discarded. It was a memory Walter had chosen to keep close, yet never share. With trembling hands, Evan unfolded the pages. To Walt, if you're reading this, it means you made it back. I hope that's true. God, I hope it's true. I want to believe you're out there somewhere, waking up to clean sheets and silence that doesn't mean danger. Maybe drinking that terrible instant coffee you like so much. Maybe remembering the nights we shared on the roof of the barracks, watching the desert pretend to be still. I never got to say goodbye the way I wanted. I never got to say, I love you with the lights on. I know we joked that we'd meet up in Boulder, get a cabin, raise dogs instead of kids. But I also know you never believed it could be real. I did. You were the bravest man I knew. Walt, not because of the uniform, but because you let me love you in the dark, even when the world outside would have torn us apart in daylight. If you ever find someone who makes you feel even a fraction of what we had, don't wait. Please don't wait. The letter ended there. No sign-off. Just the tear-stained edge of a page that had survived longer than its writer. Evan sat frozen. There was no question now. His father had loved a man named Markus, and from the way the letter spoke, Evan understood something deeper. This wasn't a phase, this wasn't confusion. This was love that had been buried under duty, silence, and fear for decades. That night, he didn't bring it up. He left the uniform folded neatly back in the box, but not the letter. He kept it in his jacket pocket, unsure why. Perhaps to protect it, perhaps to remind himself that sometimes the people we admire most are the ones who've been fighting the hardest not to disappear. In the days that followed, Evan said little, but watched more. The way Walter avoided the news when it mentioned pride, the way he flinched when neighbors casually joked about liberal stuff, the way he asked Evan, only once, if he was seeing any nice girls lately, and how his eyes darted away before hearing the answer. Evan had never officially come out to his father, not because he was afraid Walter would hate him, but because he feared Walter might see in him a reflection of something he once lost, and that reflection might hurt too much. The school performance was scheduled for Saturday evening. Evan chose not to tell his father he would be performing. It wasn't defiance. It was something quieter. He wanted to protect the memory of Markus as much as he wanted to honor it. The play was simple. A montage of voices from queer history, woven together through the lens of military service. Each student played a composite figure. One represented a nurse during the AIDS crisis. Another portrayed a closeted soldier in the 60s. Evan's character was a man who had fallen in love during deployment, but could never speak of it. The lines he was given felt eerily familiar. Some mirrored Markus's letter. Others echoed things his father had once muttered in sleep. On the night of the performance, Evan wore Walter's uniform. It hung loose on his frame, too big in the shoulders, but it fit in all the ways that mattered. On his chest, where the nameplate once sat, Evan pinned a single paper tag. It read Private M. No one asked what it meant, but everyone who saw the performance felt something catch in their throat. There was a moment during his monologue when the lights dimmed and Evan was left alone on stage. He looked out over the silent audience, into the shadows. Part of him wondered if Walter had shown up after all, if he was sitting in the back row, gripping the edge of his seat, watching a son become the voice of a truth he'd never dared to speak aloud. But when the lights came back on, there was no sign of him. Only applause, and a silence that followed Evan home, heavier than any metal. Walter didn't ask about the play. When Evan returned that night, cheeks still touched by stage makeup, fingers stained with ink from hand-drawn banners. Walter was seated in his usual chair by the window, a bottle of bourbon half emptied on the table beside him. The room smelled of pine and old fabric. The radio murmured low static tuned into nothing, yet not turned off. It was how Walter filled the quiet without confronting it. They exchanged only a glance. No questions, no welcomes. Just the hush of two generations trying to hold themselves together with threadbare rituals. Evan wanted to speak. He wanted to say, "I wore your uniform," or someone cried when I read the letter, or "I think you would have liked what I said on that stage." But the words stopped at his throat. They knew each other in a language of avoidance, and tonight was no different. He went straight to his room and lay in bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling while the radio crackled softly through the floorboards. Somewhere in the house, Walter poured another glass. By morning, the bourbon bottle was gone and so was the uniform. Evan rushed to the shed. The lock had been changed. The key behind the propane tank gone. In the living room, the photo frames were missing from the mantel. The drawer where he'd once seen his mother's card empty. Walter was packing memories away again, just as he'd always done. At breakfast, Evan finally spoke. "Did you see it?" Walter didn't look up from his coffee. "See what, you know what?" His voice was calm, not a challenge, not a plea, just a statement of presence. Walter exhaled through his nose, slowly, like it hurt. I heard it was well received. There was a long silence, the kind that stretches wide enough for shame to hide inside. Walter set his mug down with precision, as if buying time through the careful alignment of its handle to the edge of the table. You went through my things, he said. Evan nodded. Found what you wanted. I wasn't looking for anything. But you found something, Walter said. Something you think explains me. Evan swallowed. No, I found something that helped me understand how long you've been pretending. That landed like a fist. Walter's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't flinch. You don't know what it was like, he muttered. Being out there. Every minute was a test. Every friend could be the one to turn you in. Markus and I, we knew what we were risking. You weren't in danger here, Evan said softly. Not anymore. Walter's eyes finally met his son's. There was no anger in them, just fatigue. The kind of fatigue that comes from carrying yourself like a lie for too long. Yes, he said. I still was. Evan wanted to argue. To remind him that the world had changed, that no one cared if he held hands with a man in public anymore. But that would be a lie, too. He'd seen the headlines, he'd read the comments, and most of all, he'd lived with the way Walter existed, a man trained to survive silence. Walter stood and walked over to the cabinet above the fireplace. He opened it slowly, revealing an old radio recorder. It was dusted with age, but intact. He plugged it in and turned a dial. A few seconds of static. Then a voice. This is the last tape, Walt. I don't know if it'll reach you. I don't even know if we'll both make it out. But I needed to say it somewhere. At least once. Like it mattered I loved you. And I wish we'd had the chance to say it where the sun could hear us. Evan's breath caught in his chest. It wasn't just a letter. It was a confession frozen in time. Markus had found a way to leave behind more than words on paper. He'd recorded his loved one man's desperate hope pass forward like a flare in the dark. Walter stopped the tape. His hand lingered on the button. That was recorded 3 days before he died, he said, not looking at Evan. I never played it out loud until now. The house went still. For the first time, the walls seemed to breathe differently. Evan stepped closer, carefully, like the air itself might shatter. Why now, he asked. Walter didn't speak for a long time. Then, softly, as if confessing to the wallpaper, he said, because last night I heard your voice on the radio. Someone had uploaded a clip from the performance. And for the first time in years, I didn't turn it off. I listened, and I realized you weren't angry. You were giving me back a piece of yourself. The house stayed quiet after that, but it was a new kind of quiet. Not the heavy silence of denial, but the tentative quiet of two people finally standing at the edge of something true. Walter didn't say thank you. Evan didn't need him to. But when Walter walked out to the shed later that day, he didn't lock the door behind him. Spring came late that year. Snow clung to the ridgelines, and the wind still had the bite of February in it. But the house felt warmer now, not because of weather or fire, but because something between them had quietly unthawed. They didn't talk about Markus again, not directly, but Walter had started leaving the shed unlocked. He began making coffee for two instead of one. He even asked Evan about the next play at school, as if the theater now mattered to him in some unspoken way. Then, one morning in April, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Evan's school. Inside was a formal invitation addressed to Walter Dempsey, requesting his presence as a recognized veteran guest for the opening ceremony of the town's Pride Festival, hosted by the Student Council. Evan had not known about the nomination. He suspected it had been submitted anonymously, perhaps by a teacher, perhaps by someone who'd seen the play. Either way, it left both of them staring at the envelope like it had been written in a foreign language. Walter didn't say anything. He simply placed the letter on the table and walked outside. That night, Evan found the old uniform laid out across his bed. It had been cleaned, pressed. The creases were crisp again, the buttons polished, but the nameplate was missing. In its place was a small cloth, patch hand-stitched reading simply W, Dempsey and M. Evan knew then his father was going. The festival took place in the town square in an unlikely spot for rainbow flags and music. Only a few years earlier, this was the same place where Walter had once stood during a Veterans Day speech. Back straight, words clipped and formal. He had spoken about courage, sacrifice, and country, but never about himself, never about Markus. When they arrived that morning, the crowd was already gathered. Students, teachers, neighbors, even strangers with signs that read, "Love is honor and no one fights alone." Evan kept close to his father as they made their way through the crowd. He felt the weight of stares, though not hostile, curious, reverent, maybe even grateful. Walter was invited to the stage by a student with a rainbow tie and a nervous smile. The microphone buzzed as he approached. For a moment, Evan thought he might walk away. But Walter stood firm, the same way he had in desert winds and battlefield smoke. Then he spoke. "I wore this uniform for a long time. I wore it in heat and dust and in silence. I wore it for my country, for my brothers in arms, for every person who believed freedom was worth something. But I never wore it for myself. Not until today." He paused. A hush swept through the square. "I was in love once," he continued. "His name was Markus. We served together overseas. We dreamed about coming back and building something of our own, but we never got the chance. War took him, and fear kept me from ever saying his name out loud. Until now." There were no tears in his voice, only weight, a kind of settled truth that didn't ask for sympathy, only to be heard. "For years, I told myself it was too late, that I had missed my chance to be who I am. But watching my son wear my uniform on that stage, hearing him speak words I'd been too afraid to say, made me realize something. You're never too old to stop hiding." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Then applause, not explosive, not theatrical, just steady, as if each hand that clapped was trying to say, "We see you now." Evan stood at the foot of the stage, not clapping, not moving, just watching his father stand in full light. He had never seen him taller. After the ceremony, people approached, some to thank Walter for his service, others just to say thank you for being there. A man in his 60s with tear-filled eyes simply placed a hand on Walter's shoulder and walked away without a word. A young girl with two dads gave him a drawing she had made of a rainbow flag with a soldier standing beneath it. They stayed at the festival until sundown. Walter didn't say much after his speech, but he didn't leave early either. When music played, he tapped his fingers to the beat. When Evan pointed out a booth selling handmade patches, Walter bought one shaped like a dog tag with the words "Pride and Honor" etched in silver. That night, back at home, Walter sat on the porch as the stars began to crowd the sky. He lit a cigarette not to smoke, but to hold something in his hands. Evan sat beside him, a blanket over their knees. No words passed between them for a long time. Then Walter spoke, softly. "I used to think being a father meant protecting you from who I was." Evan turned to him. And now, Walter looked straight ahead. The cigarette now just smoke and ember. "Now I think maybe it means showing you what not to be afraid of." And in that quiet, shared space between them, something long buried finally stayed still. Not hidden, just finally at rest. The next morning, Walter opened the shed again. Sunlight cut through the gaps in the wood panels, catching on the dust that danced in the still air. He didn't reach for the boxes. He didn't reach for the medals, or the old photo albums, or the envelopes still sealed from a life that only he remembered. Instead, he reached for a small wooden crate tucked behind a loose panel in the floor, a place even Evan hadn't found. Inside it were the dog tags, 2 sets. One belonged to him, Walter Dempsey. The other, thinner, scratched along the edges, read simply, "Powell." He hadn't touched them in decades. That afternoon, Walter did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He sat down at his desk, took out a sheet of clean paper, and began to write. Not a letter to Markus, that time had passed, but a letter to himself, to the man who had worn a uniform like armor, to the boy who had once imagined love might be safe someday, to the father who now knew it could be. When he finished, he placed both sets of dog tags on the letter, folded it carefully, and sealed it in a new envelope. He handed it to Evan without explanation. "What is it?" Evan asked. Walter smiled faintly. "A future you won't have to hide from." Evan didn't open it. He didn't need to. The gift wasn't in the contents, it was in the offering. In the weeks that followed, things didn't become perfect. The world remained uneven. Walter still flinched at certain news headlines. Evan still carried the caution that came from growing up queer in a country that praised progress while tolerating hate. But between them, there was no longer a wall. There was space. And in that space, conversations bloomed. They talked about Markus, about the roof in Kuwait where they watched the stars, about how he once taught Walter to dance by humming tunes over the sound of desert wind. Evan asked questions gently. Walter answered without fear. When the next school event came, it wasn't a play, it was an art exhibit. The theme was portraits of courage. Evan submitted a photo. It wasn't of his father in uniform. It was of Walter standing on their porch, holding both sets of dog tags in his hand, looking directly into the lens, no longer guarded. In the background, just barely in frame, was the shed-open door, sun pouring in. The caption read, "For the man who fought for freedom abroad and finally claimed it at home." The exhibit received local attention. A news outlet picked up the story. A journalist called and asked if Walter would like to speak more publicly. He declined the interview, but gave permission for them to use the photo. "No names needed," he said. "The picture says enough." On the anniversary of Markus's death, Walter and Evan drove to a quiet lookout spot on the edge of the valley. They brought 2 folding chairs, a thermos of coffee, and silence that didn't sting. Walter placed a small flag in the dirt, not military, just a single strip of rainbow cloth folded tightly beside a white carnation. They sat as the sun dipped behind the peaks. Evan reached over, placed his hand on his father's, and held it there. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Somewhere deep in that hush, between shadow and memory, love had stopped waiting for permission, and in the end, it had come home. Do you think your parents truly know all of you, or are there parts you still keep hidden? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Heart Stories for more true stories of healing, identity, and the courage it takes to be seen.